So it's been about since May since I spoke at length in front of a group of people, so I'm going to try to get us out before opening prayer this evening. Some nervous laugh. You think I'm joking? Okay. I want to express my gratitude for the elders allowing me this opportunity to speak to you, and I'm going to try to say something that's useful. And I would like for you to listen with a critical ear, and if there's something that you think I have erred with, please let me know, and we can discuss that. And I want to, correct anything if I'm incorrect. What I'd like to talk about today, and the lesson is called "The Christian Call to Adventure." So often, we can sort of think about people who call themselves Christians being fit into two categories. Those who see their faith as a liability, and those who see it as an asset. So, what do I mean by a liability? Well, when we talk about liability in financial terms, we talk about something that exposes you to risk. So, if you have debt, unsecured debt especially, that's a liability. What happens if you don't have the income to cover a debt? Well, you default. That's a liability. In terms of like insurance companies, they think of liability as something that exposes them to greater risk. They're going to have to pay out because something is likely to cause a problem, something is likely to cause an injury, something is likely to put them at risk. That's a liability. An asset would be the opposite, something that you have that can be used in circumstances to your benefit. Now, how does liability really work in terms of your faith? Well, Jesus explained this type of person more than once. We have the first example, the parable of the sower in Matthew chapter 13, verses 3-9, when he talks about the sower sowing the seeds of the word, and it falls on various types of ground. The person who sees their faith as a liability can be seen as the one where the seeds fall among the thorns. Their faith sprouts, it grows, but the things of the world grow too, and they surround and then eventually choke out that faith. We can also see that in the story of the rich young ruler in Matthew chapter 19, starting verse 16. The rich young ruler comes up to Jesus and says, "Teacher, what do I need to do?" And he says, "Well, follow the commandments." He's like, "Great, I do that. I've done that my whole life." He's like, "All right, cool. One more thing. Give up all of your possessions and follow me." And what does the rich young ruler do? He hangs his head and he walks away because those things were very important to him, and faith became a liability. It meant he had to give up what he valued. It was a liability. In our lives, we see this pattern quite often. When you are confronted with an opportunity to speak about the gospel with a stranger or with a friend or a member of your family that may not be a Christian, how willing are you to speak up? And what risk goes through your mind when you think about, well, I could talk about the gospel with this, say, coworker, but what might happen? They may not like what I have to say. They may ostracize me. What if it's with my boss? What if it means I don't get a promotion or a raise? And we often think about these things, in sort of very trivial ways because, a lot of times those risks are either, they're not really risks or they're very small risks. Maybe you have someone that doesn't like what you have to say, and so they're a little irritated at you, and so they just, sort of spread it around to your coworkers. Well, that's a churchy person, right? Well, okay, that could be a risk, but in our world today, there are actual examples of people that have taken even greater risks. There's a couple recently in the news in Massachusetts that wanted to foster children, and the agency in Massachusetts decided after all of the applications and interviews, and they decide this is a great family, except they're Christians. And they said no, because that was not the kind of person that they wanted to put children with, in spite of the fact that Massachusetts had more than 1,500 children in their foster system that had nowhere to go and were being housed in hospital hallways. But that Christian couple, that was beyond the pale. Or there's a member of parliament in Finland who is being tried for hate crimes for tweeting a Bible verse. She was acquitted once by the court, but in Finland they don't understand this concept that we understand of dual jeopardy or double jeopardy. You can't be tried for the same crime more than once in the United States. Well, in Finland you can. And the prosecutor didn't like the result of that acquittal and so appealed to a higher court. And now that member of parliament is again facing criminal prosecution for a Bible verse tweet. So in our world, being a Christian does carry risk, but do we see that as a liability or an asset? How nervous are you to say a prayer in a restaurant? What will people think? Now, another way of thinking about our faith as a liability. When we think about sin, do we think about the things I can't do? Or do we think God has given us a way to have an abundant life? Because, well, there is sin, and there are things that we ought not do. But why? Is it because God's a killjoy, and He doesn't want us to have fun? No, because He knows what's good for us, and often, even the wisest of us don't really know what is best for us. And so if we look to God, He's got our interests in mind. Thinking about faith as a liability can make life seem like something merely to be endured rather than lived. We might think, if I can make it to the end of life without messing up too bad, I'll go to heaven. Let's look at Matthew chapter 25. You'll turn there with me, starting in verse 14. This is the parable of the talents. Jesus said, "For the kingdom of heaven is as a man traveling into a far country, who called his own servants and delivered unto them his goods. And unto one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1, to every man according to his several ability, and straightway took his journey. Then he that had received the 5 talents went and traded with the same, and made them other 5 talents. And likewise he that had received 2, he also gained other 2. But he that had received 1 went and digged in the earth, and hid his Lord's money. After a long time the Lord of those servants cometh, and reckoneth with them. And so he that had received 5 talents came and brought the other 5 talents, saying, Lord, thou deliveredst unto me 5 talents. Behold, I have gained beside them 5 talents more. You can imagine this servant coming to his master excited. Look what I did. You gave me 5 and I have 5 to give to you. I did something for you. His Lord said unto him, Well done, thou good and faithful servant. Thou hast been faithful over a few things. I will make thee ruler over many things. Enter thou unto the joy of thy Lord. He also that had received 2 talents came and said, Lord, thou deliverest unto me 2 talents. Behold, I have gained 2 other talents besides them. His Lord said unto him, Well done, good and faithful servant. Thou hast been faithful over a few things. I will make thee ruler over many things. Enter thou unto the joy of thy Lord. Then he which had received the 1 talent came and said, Lord, I knew that thou art a hard man, reaping where thou hast not sown, and gathering where thou hast not strawed. And I was afraid, and went and hid thy talent in the earth. Lo, there thou hast that is thine. His Lord answered and said, Thou wicked and slothful servant, thou knewest that I reap where I sowed not, and gather where I have not strawed. Thou oughtest therefore to have put my money to the exchangers, and then at my coming I should have received my own with usury. Take therefore the talent from him, and give it unto him which has 10 talents. So the man with 1 talent saw that as a liability. He was entrusted with something from his master, and he was afraid. He said, what if I lose it? What if I squander it? What if I damage it? I better hide it. Because what's he like? He's mean. He's gonna punish me harshly if I lose that talent. So he hid it. That was a liability. Now, the other 2 servants, they didn't see that talent as a liability. They saw that as an opportunity. It was an asset. They invested it. They worked with it, and they were able to give the master a greater abundance when he returned than what they were given. So what if we saw our faith as assets? Treating our faith as our greatest asset means that we ought to live with the confidence that God has made our lives worth living. He created the world in which we live, complete with beauty and wonder. Just look around. Every day there is something new to discover if you open your eyes. Traveling around, I've seen across the world so much variety, so many amazing things that God has given to us. He's given us the ability to produce art. He's given us the ability to construct great monuments. He's given us the ability to enhance our lives through technology and through medicine. And not only that, there's the natural world. Every part of this earth has unique life. Trees and plants of amazing beauty, flowers of all sorts of different colors, animals that live in so many different environments that God had a mind to create all of those, to live in all these different places and to be so unique. It's wonderful. And even beyond our planet, to look into a telescope and to see the infinite array of stars beyond. That is, the universe is so large I can't even fathom, and it's hard to wrap your brain around absolutely how immense the universe is, and God did that for us. You could live 1,000,000 years and never get bored. God didn't do that just for giggles. He did that because He wanted us to have an amazing life. And God has already given us a victory over death through Christ. So, what risk is there in your faith? Well, so what do we do about all that? So I've got 4 points that I want to cover this morning. Normally I do 3, but I got ambitious. First, God calls us to live life boldly. 2, living boldly requires facing challenges. 3, facing challenges successfully requires character. And 4, Jesus shows us what character is required. So let's talk about God calls us to live boldly. So let's look at a few examples. First, Abraham. We know the story of Abraham. Abraham lived in Ur of the Chaldees over in Mesopotamia. And if you know anything about history, the time period that Abraham is from, this is an era of the beginnings of civilization. And this is also an era when pagan religion was widespread. And Abraham, he was in the center of all of it. Now, this is also a wealthy part of the world if you compare it to other parts of the world at the time, not to now, but to other parts of the world at the time. This is where civilization's happening. This is the new and upcoming place to be. And God says, Abraham, And Abraham does what makes me chuckle a little bit, but it's so important. He says, here I am. God says, I have something for you to do. You're not going to understand it. You're not going to know what I'm talking about, but I need you to trust me. And Abraham's like, all right, give it to me. He says, I want you to leave your home, everything that you know, and go somewhere that you've never heard of. Now, how many of you would do that? Just pack up and say, you know what? I've never been there, never heard of it, can't find it on a map, but God said to do it, so here I go. That's hard. Abraham says, all right, I'm going. And it's not in a car, it's not by plane, he's walking. And this is an area of the world that, if we don't have air conditioning, we're not super happy. This is worse than summer in Northwest Indiana. All right? So, walking hot sand, it's dry. Hey, you have to take most of your resources with you because there's probably not going to be a whole lot along the way, but he did it. And God said, take the challenge, and there will be great reward. Now, what great reward? Abraham is told, I will make you the father of many nations. And if you think about that for half a second, you realize that's not a reward that he would even be able to see in his lifetime. So he is putting his faith in God to do something hard, to do something that might be considered by many people impossible for a reward that he will never see. Wow. And he accepted that. Said, all right, I'll go. Let's take another example. Joseph. Joseph had a hard childhood after a little bit of maybe pampering as his father's favorite. We know the story of the coat of many colors, but his brothers, they didn't take too well to his father's favoritism. And Joseph was thrown into a pit and then sold into slavery and taken to Egypt. And he spent some time in rather difficult circumstances. And he could have said, wow, God's been hard on me. I'm going to put my head down and I'm just going to deal with it. Right? I'm going to get through this. I'm not going to make waves. I'll work and maybe privately grumble a little bit because things have been a little unfair. But no, we wouldn't have had the story of Joseph if that's what Joseph had chosen to do. We instead have a Joseph that was presented with challenges and rose to meet every single one of them because of his faith in God. He was tempted by Potiphar's wife. He could have done the easy thing. He could have given in to her. Who would have known, right? It would have made things so much easier. She probably would have bestowed gifts upon him because she was in a position to do so. But he said, no, that's wrong. Even though I'm already in this disadvantageous position, I'm a slave, I have to do everything that I'm told. If I speak out, if I stand up for what's right, I could be punished. But no, that's not what God would want me to do. So he said no. And he's thrown in prison. Wow, no good deed, right? But we know subsequently, Joseph continues to be faithful. He eventually is brought before Pharaoh and able to interpret a dream for him, and Pharaoh rewards him. Joseph's faithfulness, his willingness to see challenges and adventure before him and accept it because of his faith leads him to success, to live a life that made him able to help his family when they were in need, and of course forgive them in the process for his brother's betrayal. And then of course, the rest of the story of the Old Testament would not have happened had Joseph not been in the position he had been in. He was in the right place at the right time and had the right faith to accept those challenges. What about David? David had all sorts of challenges in his life. Of course, he's called upon as a young boy to be a shepherd, to face wild animals, bears and lions as a young shepherd boy. And he overcomes that. It's like his training for what's about to happen to him. He's then called upon to go to his brothers who are on the front lines of the war with the Philistines. And while he's there, he sees nobody else is facing the challenges because there's this giant and he's terrifying. Never mind that God is on our side. We should probably say, you know what, God, you've got this, let's go. But no, that guy is huge. David says, I can do it. I'll face the challenge. And we know David overcomes the giant, Goliath. He then has to face Saul, who he had once had a good relationship with, but it turns sour once Saul realizes that David is favored over him and his descendants. And David is forced to flee. But David didn't give up. He didn't go home. He didn't go live in another country as a fugitive, as an exile for the rest of his life. He faced the challenge and he became king. And then when David messed up, we know the story of Bathsheba. David really messed up. And he was faced with his own sin. This is a challenge. And what do kings often do when faced with their own shortcomings? Now, he could have done what Saul did, executed Nathan. Could have done that. Yeah, don't talk to me. Don't point out my shortcomings. I'm the king. But no, David's like, you're right. I was wrong. He faced the challenge. Next, let's talk about Daniel. Daniel, brought into exile into Babylon. Away from home, away from all the people that he knew. He had a small group of Jews around him, but they weren't enough to really provide him any sort of protection. And he's in the center of one of the most powerful empires in the world, a pagan empire. Daniel didn't hide. And when the law was passed that you couldn't pray to any other god but Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel was like, yeah, I can't follow that one. He prayed anyway. And he overcame. And then finally Paul. And we could go on and on and on, all sorts of examples. But finally I want to talk about Paul. Paul was the kind of guy that he was going to live boldly whether he was right or wrong. And he started off quite wrong. But then he was challenged. On the road to Damascus, Jesus appears to him and says, whoa, slow your roll. You're zealous, but you're zealous wrong. You think that you are fighting for me, but you're actually fighting against me. Now, what do you do when Jesus appears to you personally and tells you your whole life has been incorrect? Well, Paul said, okay, correction, I'm going to go with God. I'm going to follow Christ, and not only am I going to become a Christian, but now I'm going to take that zeal that I had, that willingness to face the challenge of life, and I'm going to apply it right. And what did he face? He faced multiple instances of people trying to kill him. They tried to stone him. They ran him out of city after city. And eventually, he was executed. But did he ever relent? Did he ever regret? Well, we have his words. At the end, in prison, before his execution, he says, I've done it. I've finished the race, and I'm ready. So, there's challenges. In order for us to live boldly, we have to face challenges. All right? So, we talked about Abraham. He faced the challenge of coming out of Ur into the unknown. This is the call to adventure. God says, do something you don't understand, trust me. Moses did the same thing. He had gone off into the wilderness, escaping his actions after he killed the Egyptian guard, out into the wilderness to live the life of a shepherd. God calls to him and says, I need you to go back. I need you to go back to Egypt, and I need you to lead my people out of the land. Moses could have said, whoa, they're going to kill me. That's really hard. I don't think so. And he might have done it. He might have gone kicking and screaming. He might have had his heels in the sand. He wasn't overly enthusiastic about what God asked him to do, but he did it. He said, all right, okay, I'll do it. And he, of course, returned to Egypt. He led the people out after standing up to Pharaoh, who very well could have had him executed. We talked about David. He faced his challenges. We talked about Daniel. Elijah is another example. In 1 Kings chapter 18, he was called on to challenge the priests of Baal. Now, it says there are 450 of these priests that are invited to this showdown, and Elijah by himself. And he says, all right, you sacrifice a bull and you put it on the altar, and then you pray to Baal and ask him to light it on fire. And after you do that, then I will pray to my God, and whichever one responds, that's the real God. That is pretty gutsy. He's surrounded by the enemy, by people who disagree with his God and who are all on board with this pagan God. And the king is on the other side, Ahab and Jezebel. And Elijah says, all right, let's do it. Prove to me. And I love this story because Elijah not only, he's not timid. He doesn't go up and say, well, kind of like, can we kind of talk about this? No, he says, do it. And while waiting, he mocks them. He's like, oh, is your God sleeping? Right? It's not happening. What's wrong? And then, of course, God wins. Now, we have a bad example, Jonah. We know about Jonah. He's called to Nineveh. He's called into action to go to a city of 250,000 people to tell them they're wrong. He runs the other way. But in the end, after facing the belly of the fish, he reluctantly agrees. And we know it's reluctant because even after he goes and he's successful, he goes and sits down in the shade outside the city, still hoping that God rains fire down on the city. He treated his faith as a liability. So let's talk about this hero's journey. It's so important because we see it in stories, and some of the best stories that we love, our children love to read them. It's centered around this narrative structure that we see throughout the Bible. It's the hero's journey. You start around with sort of the everyday life. Your character is just doing normal things, right? And we don't really have a whole lot of stories that go on and on and on about a person's life doing normal things. That's kind of boring. Chapter 1, Paul woke up and had porridge, like yesterday. Chapter 2, Paul walked to the market for groceries, said hi to the mailman. Chapter 3, Paul sewed a tent. Not much of a story, right? We dispense with that and we jump into the call to action. And what does that call to action do for us? Well, it confronts us with ourselves. It confronts us with our shortcomings. It says, what are you good at? What are you bad at? And we're usually bad at more than we're good at. And then we have to do something about it. We have a choice. Do we rise to the occasion? Do we learn? Do we find a mentor and teach us what we need to overcome? Or do we hide? Do we refuse the challenge? And every hero story is the hero saying, all right, I'm going to mess this up, but let's give it a go. And then they usually mess up early in the story, right? You have the first set of challenges and the hero's not very good. Then they get a mentor, right? Somebody tells them, this is what you need to do to improve. And then they try it again. They voluntarily retake on the challenge and they overcome. So, how do they do that? Facing challenges successfully requires character. So what is character? Well, the ancient Greeks called the idea of character arete, or excellence. These are the things about your personality that you want to be really good at. And it's not just random, right? And it's not just one thing. Because a lot of times we think there's this really good thing I like about my personality, and I'm going to make my whole self about that one thing. Like, the person that says, you know what, I'm an honest person. I'm so honest, I'm brutally honest. Watch out. I'm going to tell you, right? Well, that's not exactly what we mean. Because character and good character requires that we have some wisdom to be able to use those traits appropriately. And we have to practice them. We have to get good at them. Honesty is an important virtue. It's an important character trait. But when somebody asks you, does this outfit make me look fat? One, bad question, not fair. Two, there is a right way to answer that without lying. The brutally honest person says exactly what they think. But, right, you can wisely answer that question. Here's another example. Courage. Courage is one that the Greeks were very happy to use as an example because it sort of lends itself to this explanation. So courage is, to the Greeks, a midpoint between cowardice and recklessness. It's a balance, and you have to know when to use it. So what is cowardice? Cowardice is running away when you shouldn't run away. And they usually would use a battle because, of course, the Greeks were warlike. So you go into battle, and if you're standing there in the phalanx and you see the enemy, like, whoa, I'm out of here, and you turn and you run and you leave your comrades, you're a coward. But you also don't want to be the guy that gets himself so hyped up and runs out ahead of everybody and you're the first to die. Well, did you succeed in defeating your enemy? Of course not, because you just left your army with one fewer soldier than what they needed. That's not courage either, that was stupid. So there's these two extremes. Courage is in the middle. Stand there in the line with your comrades, face the enemy, don't run away, but do the right thing. Follow the plan. Work together. And of course, we can apply courage in all sorts of situations in life, and it takes wisdom to know what level of courage is right. It takes practice. We can also talk about patience. Patience is another virtue. The midpoint between the two extremes, there's rashness, which is no patience at all, and inaction. To be patient to the point where you never do anything, that's not patience either. Patience is somewhere in the middle, and it takes wisdom to be able to figure that out. And these are just examples. There's all sorts of character traits, of virtues that God calls on us to work on. The call to adventure exposes our character, or its lack thereof. Now, refusing to take the adventure says something about our character too. Maybe it's our lack of courage. Maybe it's our lack of wisdom. And it denies us our ability to develop. We also know that character is in the heart. Matthew chapter 15, starting in verse 18. But those things which proceed out of the mouth come from the heart, and they defile the man. For out of the heart proceed evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witness, blasphemies. Those evil things come from the heart, but so do good things. Honesty comes from the heart. Courage comes from the heart. So, what character is required? What does God say we need to work on? Well, Jesus shows us the example. Jesus demonstrated character, and he set the bar for us. First, Jesus pursued knowledge and wisdom. In Luke chapter 2, we have the young Jesus, starting in verse 41. Now his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover, and when he was 12 years old, they went up to Jerusalem after the custom of the feast. And when they had fulfilled the days, as they returned, the child Jesus tarried behind in Jerusalem. And Jesus and his mother knew not of it, but they supposed him to have been in the company, went a day's journey, and they sought him among their kinsfolk and acquaintance. And when they found him not, they turned back to Jerusalem seeking him. And it came to pass that after 3 days they found him in the temple, sitting in the midst of the doctors, both hearing them and asking them questions. And all that heard him were astonished at his understanding and answers. And when they saw him, they were amazed. Jesus, from a young age, pursued wisdom. It wasn't an afterthought. It wasn't just, well, I'll just sort of live my life and my experience eventually will shape me up. It's an active pursuit. This is part of his character, to have wisdom. And he showed that wisdom many times through the Gospels. One of the best examples that comes to mind is when he's faced with the Pharisees who bring him the woman caught in adultery. And they said, well, the rule is, you're caught in adultery, you get stoned. What ought we to do with her? Now, of course, they're trying to set him up. They're trying to put him in a difficult or an impossible position where if he says, stone her, well, what authority does this guy have to order the stoning of somebody? But if he says don't, then he's violating the law. What does he do? Well, Jesus shows wisdom, and he throws it back at them. He says, if you're perfect, go ahead. And of course, none of them were, and they all knew it, and so they left. He showed wisdom. Jesus was also kind and understanding. In John chapter 2, he goes to a wedding. He's not ready to start his ministry yet, but his mother, she knows who he is. She comes to him and says, hey, we've got this problem. And we often overlook this and just sort of, talk about this as the miracle of Jesus turning water into wine. But it's very important to understand the social implications. His hosts risked a damaged reputation. Hospitality was so important. And if they had run out of wine and their guests had gone without, and it would have looked very poor on them. And so Jesus was understanding. It wasn't, let's have a party and everybody get wasted. It was, my friends are at risk of social alienation for no good reason. Let me fix it. John chapter 4, the Samaritan woman at the well. He shows kindness to a woman that was clearly sinful. They talk. She's like, how do you know what you know? And he says, well, why don't you go bring your husband here. She's like, I don't have a husband. He's like, you're right. You have a few. But he doesn't condemn her for it. He says, listen to me. I'll help you. Matthew chapter 9. Jesus is faced with the multitudes. They're out in the desert. They're listening to him. They're hungry to hear what he has to say, but they're also hungry. They haven't brought food with them. They've left behind comfort to come and listen to him. And it says he was moved with compassion on the multitude. Jesus was also righteous in anger. We know the story of him going into the temple and overturning the tables of the money changers in John chapter 2. It wasn't for him. He didn't say, this really teased me off. He said, this is against God. And he did something about it. Jesus was patient. Matthew chapter 14. Jesus he goes out to his apostles. They were on a boat. He walks out to them on the water, and Peter, in his excitement, says, I'm coming out. And he starts to walk on water, and then he falters. He gets scared. He looks down, and he starts to sink. And Jesus doesn't let him drown. He doesn't say, idiot. He says, try again. Have better faith. He was patient. Then, in Matthew chapter 26, they're in the garden in Gethsemane, and Jesus asks a few of his disciples to wait with him. Stay awake. I need my friends. And he goes off and he prays. He comes back and they're asleep. And he doesn't say, get out of here. I'll get some different guys. You guys are worthless. He just says, come on, please stay awake, guys. And then he goes and he prays again and he comes back and they're asleep again. And he wakes them up. He's like, come on, I need you to stay awake. And then he goes and he comes back a third time and they're asleep again. He's like, all right, you're tired. He was patient. Jesus was honest. Jesus didn't spare the rich young ruler what he needed to hear. Before Pilate asked, are you the king of the Jews? Jesus is like, you said it. He didn't try to save himself by hiding the truth. And then, of course, with the woman caught in adultery, Jesus didn't say, oh, it's okay. It's like, all right, they're not going to kill you. I'm not going to condemn you, but don't do it again. He was honest. He showed courage. He knew what was going to happen, and he faced it willingly. We know throughout the gospel, Jesus said, I am going to be killed. And he walked into it with his eyes open. He had courage. He wasn't foolish, though. And this goes back to that, what level is courage? There were several times when Jesus was faced with danger, and he waited for the right time. When it was the right time, he walked in to danger. But at other times, he was faced with a crowd, and he got away. He was faced with the authorities trying to seize him, and he made it out. He made it into the wilderness. He crossed over the sea. He waited for the right time and then walked in with his eyes open. Paul gives us a pretty good metaphor that encapsulates how we ought to think about these character traits that Jesus shows. In Ephesians chapter 6, he talks about the whole armor of God. Starting in verse 11, he talks about girding your loins about with the gospel of truth. We have that honesty. 2, feet shod with the preparation of the gospel of peace, knowledge. The shield of faith. 4, the helmet of salvation, confidence in God. And 5, the sword of the Spirit, the only part of the armor that's offensive, that's an actual weapon, but it doesn't belong to us, it belongs to God. Let God fight. Jesus knew when to display the correct traits in the correct circumstances. That shows wisdom. We might also call it discernment. Jesus' life is told in the gospel for our guidance. However, it is key to understand that when we are told to strive to be like Christ, it doesn't mean that we have to walk through the desert as nomads or wandering ascetics. This is the literalism that the Pharisees tripped over with the old law. It is the character of Christ that we are supposed to emulate. And by doing so, we can take on the challenges of life, and we ought to do so willingly, enthusiastically. To see life as an adventure. We can't develop character if we don't properly orient and value our faith. Treating faith as a liability will make us like the man who hid his talent. It will not grow. We will not develop in those godly traits that Christ gave us as an example. And so, God calls us to live life, not mourn it. We can't avoid the challenges of life, but we can develop our character to be able to face them with confidence that God has our backs. Voluntarily facing our challenges makes life an adventure and one worth living. And in Christ, the victory is already won. What better way to live life is there than that? But you have to choose that life. If you've already chosen that life, if you are a Christian, but you're not taking on the challenge willingly, if you see your faith as a liability, you need to work on that. If you haven't chosen Christ yet, well then life is a liability. Because when your life is over and you're not in Christ, that's it. But life can be an asset in Christ. If you're ready for that, and don't do it if you're not ready, but you should be, because challenges are hard. But if you're ready for that challenge, if you're ready to live life as an adventure, to accept God as your mentor, to accept the victory in Christ, there's no better time. Come forward as we stand and sing.